A large part of a developer's job is to make decisions on behalf of their team or their company. This can be quite scary, so I wanted to make a bit of a video on it. For context, I have just left my job. I don't have a backup, which is quite scary, but I'm sure I'll find something. And I gave them 2 months' notice, which is why I haven't uploaded a video in about 2 months. But I found that in this process, one of the big things I'm trying to do is just leave them in a good position going forward. So I have owned a lot of the front end systems in terms of decision making and structure, architecture, all that kind of stuff for the past 2.5 to 3 years. And many of the decisions I've made have impacted other developers, how they have to develop, how they structure their code, all that kind of stuff. And I've tried to get them to engage with it a bit more so they have a better understanding of essentially this design system I've set up for them. But generally, the pushback has been, oh, why don't we use MUI or Tailwind or something similar along those lines? And now that I'm leaving, I've sort of given into that and said, well, look, if you guys won't engage with this system, that's fair enough. Let's try and get MUI set up so that you're in a good position to move forward. But there's sort of an expectation that I'm going to do all that and take ownership of the new system, even though they're aware that I'm leaving. And so, talking to management, one of the big things has been that we need people to be willing to make decisions and take ownership. Just because I know that a lot of people struggle with these things like decisions, and it's very easy to say, oh, you just make a decision and that's all grand. I want to explain that, like, I struggle with emotional dysregulation. So the decisions are not easy for me. I don't know if I have autism or something along those lines. I haven't gotten a diagnosis. But I have struggled with emotions since I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. I remember when I was 13, I got a physics exam result back. It wasn't even a major exam, it was just a, end of the month kind of exam. And I got 92%. So I'd gotten one question wrong. And I remember crying. And I didn't know at the time why I was crying. Like, logically, I understood that people get questions wrong. We can't be perfect. This is just a small test. But I just lost control of my face and my ability to stop crying, essentially. And I felt embarrassed. And I locked myself off from that as much as I could. Sort of tried to hold it all back. And it really impacted my life, I think, to some extent. I'm 34 now, and I've held back from a lot of things that could have been big decisions for me. I've kind of taken a default path because I felt I need to be away from emotionally traumatic situations, or however you want to phrase that I don't put myself in a vulnerable position where people might make fun of me or that kind of thing. And it's only in the past few years I've really come out of that. I would say 3 or 4 years, that I've opened myself back up to, kind of emotional engagement and all that kind of stuff. Because I sort of feel very raw in those situations, you know. Um, I often find if someone asks a simple question like, where do you want to go for lunch? I'm concerned about what they think of my decision on that, you know. If I say, oh, let's go for pizza or something, are they going to say, oh, I wanted to go for, Indian food or Chinese food, whatever else? Or are they going to go along with me just because it makes me happy and, they're not happy, but they're doing it for my sake? And all these small things become very overbearing sometimes. So it can seem silly sometimes. But when it comes to making decisions for a company, it's again another level of responsibility and vulnerability. We make a decision without full information. Sometimes there are multiple solutions that have different pros and cons, and we don't know which one to go with. And one of the things people tend to miss is that not making a decision is probably the worst decision you can make. We had a situation recently in the office where we were on a refinement session, and we're talking about three different approaches to solving one of our front end problems that we need to rework before we can move to the new system. And we were talking about breaking down these solutions and going into how long each would take, what were the pros and cons. And anytime I tried to ask any of the others for input, it was just silence. It'd be like, okay, well, we can break this down. Here's if we take this approach, these are the pros, these are the cons. Does anyone have any more? Okay, let's break down the ticket. What do you guys think? How long would this take? And again, silence. And I've ended up estimating tickets that I won't be around for. I've already left. I'm done. They're going to start doing these tickets in about a week. And I don't know if they agree with those estimates. I don't know if they disagree or they had some other idea for what to do. But they didn't tell me. And I think part of that is that on the team in general, we've built a very technical but not emotional team. They're very willing to give technical criticism, but they're not very good at phrasing it or at encouraging people. And so I've had the experience of presenting an idea and having 5 people, criticize it, for an hour. And then we say, well, okay, well, what's the alternative that we have? It's sort of like, oh, well, there is no alternative. We're just tearing down your idea, essentially, Not in so many words, but that's essentially what's happening. One of the management recently joked to me that it was like, oh, well, you've solved 80% of our problems with this solution, but what about the other 20% we haven't solved yet? You need to solve those or it's not perfect. I think in most of these cases, the developers are afraid to make a decision that isn't perfect because they'll receive criticism or they'll be responsible when something goes wrong. And that's just not the way to grow as a developer. One of the things we have to do is just get comfortable with criticism and get comfortable with letting an idea sit, even if it's not perfect. We need to build a culture that allows for vulnerability, and we need to be willing to engage with that in a vulnerable way. So if I put my idea forward, I can be accommodating to people giving criticism. I can sit and listen to it patiently rather than thinking about what the rebuttal is to their comment in my head, which is often the way I see a lot of these meetings is people present something and then they immediately go into defensive mode when someone criticizes. And so the culture is a very large part of this, and also individuals need to be comfortable doing that and to push themselves to do it. With a business, they really don't want to be involved in decisions. They don't want to have decisions register on the business level. So one of my previous companies needed a system to provide high uptime for containerized services. And so we used a VMware cluster in a data center, and I built a system using GitLab for CI, CD, deploying using Ansible into a Docker Swarm environment. And when I came up with a solution for them, I presented it to the company, and the first question was, is this an industry best practice? Now, this was 2018, so Docker was still new enough. There weren't big established trends around it. Most of the tutorials were, here's your Docker Compose up, and then, yeah, Docker, great. So trying to do this kind of custom deployment system was really not something we had much guidance on. And so I had to say to them, I don't know if this is an industry best practice. I haven't seen one for this system, but I know that it'll work. And so we went ahead with that system. And about 6 months later, I had a colleague set up her own service using this system. And she turned around to me and she said, this is really great. It's like magic. It just works, And And she went on and added a whole bunch of new functionality to it over the next few years and kind of took ownership of it. She'd come in and really understood the system, broken down all the parts of it, and figured out how to rework it to do other things, essentially, like updating routers and all that kind of stuff. And it was a really proud moment for me because I had built a system that someone else who I respected came in and was able to reuse and rework and saw some value in. And so that was a really big win for me, on a personal, like, confidence level, kind of view of things. And I almost feel like people rob themselves of that by not trying things, not being willing to say, hey, I don't know if this will work, but let's try it. It's the best we can do. And so this system I built at my previous company has been up and running for 6 years now, and they're hiring someone to replace it. But I don't have the qualifications necessary for the job that they're hiring. Even though I built the previous system, um, the problem is that I figured that out. I was a developer at the company and I figured out how to do that system, essentially. I wouldn't be hired or I wouldn't have been hired to take on that project because I wouldn't have had the necessary experience with Docker or with, Ansible, all that kind of stuff. But because I was in that position, I had the opportunity to step forward and go, hey, this is something I can solve. And I think that's a really big opportunity to move forward in your career. You know, people often complain about you need 2 years of experience with React to get a job at web development kind of thing. And that's obviously a very hard problem. But this happens at higher levels as well. It's 4 years of leading agile teams or something, and you go, well, how do I get there? And really the answer is you step up to that from, where you are. You go, I'm putting myself out there, I'm taking a risk, and I am stepping up to this responsibility. A company will only hire you for things because they're certain that you know how to solve them. But to get to that position, you have to be willing to take on responsibility in your current role. We kind of have this idea that like time in the industry defines, you know, seniority, all that kind of stuff. I talked about this in my first video, but I think it's important to know that there are no shortcuts. If you go into a role and you say, well, I'm junior, so I'm not going to make any decisions. I'll let the seniors make all the decisions. And then when you get your promotion 5 years later or whatever time it is, you realize, oh, well, I still don't feel confident making decisions. The only way out is through, essentially. And so when it comes to YouTube, this is a whole new thing for me. I last uploaded a video when I had 7 subscribers, and now we're at well over 200. And I really felt the pressure to be like, oh, well, if someone comes back and gives me some valid biting criticism, you know, maybe I'm not good enough for this, or, I might get upset. But I've really been amazed by the response. People always say YouTube sections are, cesspools, all that kind of thing. But really, everyone's been very nice, People have come back and said they enjoyed the video or they saw some value in it. Or they've said, no, you're wrong, and here's my reasoning why. And, you know, they'll go into things like, oh, well, this is a bad example. It doesn't represent this case. It's a case by case basis. And I really appreciate all those comments because they're phrased in a way that is constructive and reasonable. They're not, you suck, go away kind of thing, which is more what I was expecting from YouTube. And maybe that's a, bias from seeing bigger channels. And I'm sure those kind of people will still arrive if I do continue. I might have to deal with them at some point, but I've been really surprised by the response. And so I want to thank everyone who's left a comment or reached out. And I don't want to become involved in the YouTube game. I have one clickbaity thumbnail, the code review one, But I thought that'd be a bit of fun. But I don't want to say, hey, look, I'm going to upload every week or I'm going to respond to all your comments. I don't want to have obligations with YouTube because I don't want it to feel like a job. I want it to be a place where I can share an idea and see other people's opinions, and hopefully that other people get some value from both maybe what I say and what other people say in the comments. A lot of these questions are subjective. I have a personal bias against kind of large process over engineering because I prefer smaller companies. And I've worked with a lot of startups, and my first job was doing, I think, 10 or 15 deployments a day. Can we get this fixed? Yeah, I can have that done in 5 minutes and it'll be on production. Um, that's obviously not scalable to the size of certain companies, but it's kind of the way I prefer to work. And so that's my bias. Um, and I'm sure, other people have their own biases too, but I think between us, we can kind of talk through ideas and not take any person's word for gospel, just say, hey, this is this person's opinion and maybe it's of value or maybe it's not. And maybe it helps me refine my ideas. So I just want to thank you again for just the great response and like the people who have been so supportive and so reasonable with their criticism. I am absolutely in favor of people coming back and saying, no, I think you're wrong, and here are my reasons. You know, and yeah, I just want yeah really show my appreciation for that. So thank you all, and have a good one.